On a Tuesday morning in March of 2009, a flatbed truck pulled up to the end of Nora Vandermeer's driveway on County Road 14 in Tama County, Iowa, and the driver didn't knock on the door or ring the bell. He just tilted the bed and let a load of cracked glass pane slide off onto the gravel shoulder, the way you'd dump gravel or old shingles, and then he drove away. Nora was 22 years old. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and she watched the whole thing happen without moving. The panes were factory seconds from the Hartfield glass facility in Toledo, tempered glass cut for commercial greenhouses, rejected for hairline fractures too fine to see with the naked eye, but wide enough that the facility's quality control team couldn't ship them. They had nowhere to go. Nora's father, Peter Vandermeer, had agreed to take them off the company's hands 6 months earlier as a favor to a man he knew from church, and the first load had arrived in September of 2008 without anyone in the family thinking too hard about what they'd do with them. That first load had sat in a pile beside the barn through the winter. This was the second load, and there would be 7 more after it. Let me tell you about Tama County, Iowa in 2009, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what Nora did with 9 years of broken glass. Tama County sits in the central eastern part of the state, corn and soybean country in the flattest, most serious sense of those words. The land there doesn't roll so much as it breathes, long, low undulations that make you feel like you're walking across the chest of something sleeping. In 2009, the county had roughly 18,000 people spread across a dozen small towns and several hundred farms, and the economy ran on grain prices, equipment financing, and the quiet, generational understanding that you farmed what your father farmed and you farmed it the way he taught you. Peter Vandermeer had been farming his 480 acres since 1987. His father had farmed the same ground before him, corn in the north fields, soybeans in the south, a small kitchen garden behind the house that Nora's mother, Liesel, tended with a precision that bordered on the devotional. That was the shape of things. That was the shape of things for everyone. Peter was a methodical man, not uncurious but disciplined in the way that men who have borrowed heavily against land become disciplined, careful, consistent, suspicious of anything that promised more than it could prove. He rotated his corn and beans on a 2-year cycle. He bought equipment from the same dealer in Marshalltown he'd used since 1991. He attended the county extension meetings and read the university bulletins and did, more or less, exactly what they recommended. His yields were good. Not spectacular, but reliable. In a county built on reliability, that was its own form of reputation. He was not a man who wasted things, which is why he'd said yes to the cracked glass panes, even though he had no plan for them. You didn't say no to something that might be useful. You said yes, and you figured it out later. Nora had grown up watching her father figure things out. She'd also grown up watching what he didn't figure out, and the two lists were different in ways she'd started cataloging before she was old enough to name what she was doing. She'd gone to Iowa State in the fall of 2005, 18 years old, the first Vandermeer to go to a 4-year university. She studied horticulture and agricultural business, and in her second year she took a course from a professor named Dr. Anita Osei, who taught controlled environment agriculture, greenhouses, hydroponic systems, season extension, year-round production. Dr. Osei had spent 12 years working with commercial greenhouse operations in the Netherlands before coming to Ames, and she had a way of talking about glass and light and soil temperature that made Nora feel like she was being handed a key to a room she hadn't known existed. She graduated in May of 2009, 3 weeks after that second flatbed truck dumped its load of cracked panes on County Road 14. Let me tell you about what Nora saw when she looked at those panes, because most people looked at them and saw a disposal problem. Peter looked at them and saw an obligation he'd honored. The driver looked at them and saw a Tuesday. Nora looked at them and saw the bones of something. She'd been thinking about controlled environment agriculture since her junior year. She'd written her senior thesis on the economics of small-scale greenhouse production in the upper Midwest, specifically on the gap between what grocery distributors paid for locally grown winter tomatoes and what it cost to produce them in a properly insulated, properly oriented glass structure. The gap was significant. The numbers Dr. Osei had helped her run suggested that a well-designed greenhouse on existing farm property, using existing infrastructure for utilities and water, could generate between $60,000 and $90,000 per year in gross revenue on roughly 4,000 square feet of productive growing space. The capital cost of building that structure from new commercial glass was the obstacle. It was always the obstacle. New tempered greenhouse glass ran between $12 and $18 per square foot in 2009. A 4,000 square foot structure needed roughly 6,000 square feet of glazing material when you accounted for the roof pitch and wall angles. That was between $72,000 and $108,000 in glass alone, before you touched framing, heating, irrigation, or labor. The cracked panes sitting at the end of the driveway were free. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When you look at a cracked pane of glass, what do you see? Most people see something broken, something that failed its original purpose, something that belongs in a landfill or a recycling bin or, at best, a scrap pile that you'll deal with someday when you get around to it. What Nora saw was a structural question, not a material question. The hairline fractures in factory second-tempered glass don't compromise the pane's insulation value. They don't change the light transmission. They don't make the glass weaker in any meaningful sense for a low-pressure application like a greenhouse wall or roof panel. What they do is make the glass unsellable to commercial greenhouse builders who have liability concerns and quality specifications to meet. The glass wasn't broken, it was just disqualified. And disqualified is a very different thing from broken. She sat down with her thesis notes and her calculator at the kitchen table 3 days after she came home from Ames, and she started working out what she actually had. The first load had been 48 panes, each 4 feet by 8 feet, which was 32 square feet per pane, which was 1,536 square feet of glazing material sitting in a pile beside the barn. The second load that had just arrived was 62 panes. That was 1,984 square feet. Combined, she had 3,520 square feet of factory second-tempered glass that had cost her family nothing but the favor owed to a man from church. She needed 6,000 square feet to build the structure she'd designed in her thesis. She was already more than halfway there, and she hadn't spent $1. She brought it to the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in April. Her mother was doing dishes. Her father was reading the Farm Bureau newsletter. She spread the thesis out and the calculator tape and the rough sketches she'd done of the structure she had in mind. A lean-to greenhouse running along the south face of the existing machine shed, oriented to maximize winter sun exposure, framed with treated lumber and steel angle iron, glazed with the factory seconds, heated with a repurposed propane unit already sitting unused in the shed. She'd priced the framing materials at the lumber yard in Toledo. She'd called a plumber in Marshalltown about the irrigation line. She'd talked to the extension office about tomato variety selection for winter production. She had a number. The total capital outlay, assuming they received enough paints to complete the glazing, was $11,200. The projected first-year gross revenue, based on contracts she'd researched with 2 regional grocery distributors and a restaurant supply company in Cedar Rapids, was between $44,000 and $62,000. The kitchen went quiet. Liesel stopped washing. Peter set down the newsletter. He looked at the papers for a long time. He was not a man who responded quickly to new ideas. He was a man who turned them over slowly, the way you turn a stone in your hand to feel its weight from every angle. He asked about the structural load of the glass on the machine shed wall. He asked about the heating costs in January and February. He asked about what happened if the distributors didn't come through. Nora had answers for all of it. She'd been preparing answers for 3 days. After a while, Peter folded the newsletter and set it on the counter, and he said, without looking up, that he needed to think about it. Liesel dried her hands on the dish towel and walked past Nora's chair and put her hand on Nora's shoulder for just a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he said to Nora that May, and why it mattered more than he intended it to. Dale Crowley was 58 years old in 2009 and had been selling agricultural supplies and greenhouse equipment out of his operation on Highway 30 for 22 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built something real in Tama County, a business that employed 11 people, that sponsored the county fair's 4-H greenhouse competition, that had outfitted more than 40 commercial growing operations across 3 counties. He knew his business. He knew his customers. He knew what worked and what didn't, and he had 22 years of evidence to back up that knowledge. He also held court at the co-op on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of every month, which was where Nora made the mistake of bringing her proposal in the 3rd week of May. She hadn't meant it to be a public conversation. She'd come to ask Crowley about sourcing the steel angle iron for the framing at a price she could afford, and she'd brought the sketches because she knew he'd asked to see them. There were 6 other men at the counter when she walked in, 2 equipment dealers, a seed rep, and 3 farmers she'd known since childhood. Crowley looked at the sketches for about 45 seconds. Then he looked up. He said the structure she was describing wouldn't hold snow load on that roof pitch with tempered glass, cracked or otherwise. He said the lean-to orientation against the machine shed would create a thermal bridging problem that would eat her heating budget alive. He said the distributors she'd named didn't buy from operations under 10,000 square feet because the logistics didn't pencil out for them. He said all of this in a reasonable, measured voice, the voice of a man who had seen a lot of young people come in with ideas that didn't survive contact with reality. Then he said, not unkindly but not quietly either, that a 22-year-old with a horticulture degree and a pile of cracked glass wasn't going to build a greenhouse business in Tama County, Iowa, and that she'd be better off helping her father with the corn. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then one of the equipment dealers laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a collegial laugh, the kind that says we're all in agreement here, the kind that closes a door. Crowley smiled. His smile was not unkind. That was almost the worst part. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. That laugh, you know that laugh. You've heard it in a meeting room or a co-op counter or a family dinner table, and you know what it does. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't engage with your numbers or your research or your drawings. It just places you outside the circle of people whose ideas are worth taking seriously. And it does it so efficiently and so socially that the people laughing don't even know they're doing something wrong. They think they're saving you from embarrassment. They think they're being helpful. Dale Crowley thought he was being helpful. He was wrong about that. He was also wrong about the snow load, the thermal bridging, and the distributors. But he didn't know that yet. Nora rolled up her sketches and thanked him for his time. She drove home on County Road 14 and sat in the truck in the driveway for a few minutes. Then she went inside and called Dr. Osei at Iowa State. Let me tell you about the science, because Nora had done the work and the work was sound, and you should understand what she actually knew before you understand what she built. The snow load concern Crowley had raised was real but solvable. Standard tempered glass, rated for commercial greenhouse applications, carries a snow load rating of between 25 and 40 pounds per square foot, depending on thickness. The factory second panes from Hartfield were 5/16 inch tempered, rated at 32 pounds per square foot, sufficient for Tama County's design snow load of 28 pounds per square foot with a safety margin. The hairline fractures in the rejected panes didn't change this rating because tempered glass fails in a specific way. It shatters completely rather than cracking progressively, and a hairline fracture in a tempered pane doesn't propagate under load the way it would in annealed glass. Dr. Osei had confirmed this. She'd also pointed Nora to a 2004 University of Minnesota extension study on the use of reclaimed and factory-second glazing materials in small-scale agricultural structures, which documented 23 installations across the upper Midwest using exactly this class of material, with 0 structural failures over a 5-year observation period. The thermal bridging problem Crowley had identified was also real, but Nora had already designed around it. The machine shed's south wall was poured concrete block, which is a poor thermal bridge compared to steel or aluminum framing. She'd planned a 2-inch polyiso insulation layer between the shed wall and the greenhouse interior, with a thermal break at the base plate. Dr. Osei had reviewed the design and said the heat loss calculation was within acceptable range for a propane-heated structure in Iowa's climate zone. The heating cost projection Nora had built into her budget was based on a modeled January average of -8 degrees Fahrenheit overnight low, which was the 99th percentile cold event for Tama County. She'd built in a 20% contingency on top of that. The distributor question was the one that had kept her up at night, and it was the one she'd done the most work on. Crowley was right that the 2 regional distributors she'd initially researched had minimum volume requirements that a 4,000 square foot first-year operation couldn't reliably meet. But there was a third channel he hadn't mentioned because it hadn't existed in his mental map of how greenhouse produce moved in central Iowa. In 2008 and 2009, a network of farm-to-restaurant direct sales relationships was developing across the upper Midwest, driven by chefs in Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Iowa City, who were building menus around locally sourced winter produce and couldn't get it from conventional distributors. Nora had spent 2 months in the spring of 2009 calling restaurants. She had letters of intent from 4 restaurants in Cedar Rapids and 2 in Iowa City, committing to purchase winter tomatoes, cucumbers, and leafy greens at prices between 30 and 40% above what the regional distributors paid. She also had a conversation underway with a specialty grocery in Ames that was building a local food section. The distributor channel Crowley had described was not the channel she was using. He'd been answering a question she hadn't asked. Peter gave her permission on a Sunday afternoon in early June, 6 weeks after the kitchen table conversation. He didn't say much. He said she could use the south wall of the machine shed and the electrical service from the shed panel, and he said she had until the end of the growing season to get the frame up before he needed the equipment access back. He said she could plant her 100 square feet of test beds in the back corner of the kitchen garden in the meantime. He said all of this in the same measured voice he used for every farm decision, and Nora said thank you and went to find her notebook. The third load of glass panes arrived in August, the fourth in November. By the time she broke ground on the frame in September of 2009, she had 4,212 square feet of factory second tempered glass stacked along the machine shed wall, sorted by size and condition, tagged with the load number and the pane dimensions in her handwriting. She'd built a simple wooden rack system to keep them from resting against each other. Not one pane had broken in storage. Let me tell you about the build, because it took longer than she'd planned, and it cost more than she'd budgeted, and it was worth every minute and every dollar. She framed the structure herself with help from her younger brother, Don, who was 17 and stronger than he looked, and who asked almost no questions and handed her things when she needed them. The steel angle iron came from a salvage yard in Waterloo that she'd found through a listing in the Farm Bureau Classifieds, not from Crowley's operation. The treated lumber came from the same lumber yard she'd priced in April. The propane unit she'd identified in the shed turned out to need a new heat exchanger, which cost $800 she hadn't planned for. She found it by selling the first season's kitchen garden test crop, tomatoes and basil, directly at the Tama County Farmers Market in August and September of 2009, which generated $1,200 in cash and introduced her to 3 restaurant buyers she hadn't previously contacted. She glazed the structure over 3 weekends in October with Dawn and her mother and a neighbor named Ferris Ostrander, who was 64 years old and had spent 30 years doing finish carpentry, and who showed up with a caulk and gun and a level and didn't charge her anything. The glazing took longer than she'd expected because the factory second panes weren't perfectly uniform. The Hartfield facility had produced them in 3 slightly different size runs, and she'd had to design the frame with adjustable glazing channels to accommodate the variation. Ferris figured out the channel system on the second weekend, sitting on an overturned bucket with a piece of paper and a pencil, and it worked. The last pane went in on a Saturday afternoon in late October, and Nora stood inside the structure in the late afternoon light and looked at the way the sun came through the glass and landed on the concrete floor in long rectangles, warm and specific, and she didn't say anything for a while. She planted in November tomatoes, a determinate variety called Mountain Fresh Plus that Dr. Osei had recommended for its heat tolerance and shelf life, cucumbers along the east wall, 3 varieties of lettuce in the raised beds along the center aisle. She'd installed a drip irrigation system from components she'd sourced through an online agricultural supply company for 30% less than Crowley's catalog price. The heating system ran on a programmable thermostat she'd calibrated herself using a data logger she'd borrowed from the extension office. She kept records of everything: temperature at 6 points in the structure, humidity, light levels at the bench surface, water use per irrigation cycle, germination rates, days to first harvest. The notebook Dr. Osei had told her to keep became 3 notebooks by February. The first harvest came in January of 2010. 42 pounds of tomatoes, 18 pounds of cucumbers, 31 pounds of mixed lettuce. She drove it to Cedar Rapids herself in the bed of the farm truck, packed in plastic bins she'd bought at the restaurant supply store. The chef at the first restaurant she'd contracted with, a woman named Margot, who ran a 40-seat bistro on First Avenue, came out to the parking lot in her apron to look at the tomatoes. She picked one up and smelled it. She said, in a tone that was not quite surprised but was adjacent to it, that these were good. Nora said she knew. Margot paid her on the spot. Cash. $38 per pound for the heirloom variety and $22 per pound for the mountain fresh. Nora drove home with $412 in her jacket pocket and stopped at the gas station in Tama to buy a cup of coffee, and she sat in the truck in the parking lot and looked at the money for a while. Let me tell you about the first full year, because the numbers are the story and the story deserves its numbers. In the 12 months ending November 2010, the Vandermeer greenhouse, which Nora had not yet named, which was still just the structure on the south side of the machine shed, generated $67,214 in gross revenue. The capital cost of the build had been $13,400, including the heat exchanger and the irrigation system and the glazing hardware and the lumber and the angle iron. The first year operating costs, propane, water, seed, growing media, packaging, delivery fuel, came to $22,800. Net income in year one was $44,414 on a structure built almost entirely from glass that had been dumped at the end of the driveway. Peter heard the year-end number on a December evening in 2010. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the farm's annual accounts spread in front of him. Corn at $4.12 per bushel, beans at $9.40, a reasonable year, but not a remarkable one. Nora put her own numbers on the table beside his. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at her. He said quietly that he hadn't expected that. She said she had. He almost smiled. He said she could expand to the north wall of the shed in the spring if she wanted. She said she'd already drawn the plans. Let me tell you about what Dale Crowley was doing in 2010 and 2011, because his story was running in parallel with Nora's, and the two stories were heading toward the same place from opposite directions. Crowley's greenhouse equipment business had been built on the commercial grower market. The operations running 10,000 square feet or more that bought new glazing systems, aluminum extrusion framing, and industrial climate control equipment. In 2009 and 2010, several of his largest customers were consolidating or going out of business as the post-recession credit market made equipment financing difficult. His new sales were down 23% in 2010. He'd let 2 employees go. He was still holding court at the co-op on the second and fourth Tuesday, still talking about the market with the authority of a man who'd been in it for 22 years. He still believed what he'd told Nora in May of 2009. He had no particular reason not to. The 5th load of glass panes arrived in the spring of 2011, the 6th in the fall, the 7th in the spring of 2012. Each load arrived the same way: flatbed truck, no knock, tilted bed, gravel shoulder. Each load was sorted and racked by Nora within a week of arrival. By the spring of 2012, she had expanded the greenhouse operation to cover both the south and north walls of the machine shed and had begun construction on a freestanding structure in the field immediately east of the barn. A gutter-connected double-span design she'd developed with input from Dr. Ossie and a structural engineer in Ames who reviewed the plans for a flat fee of $400. The freestanding structure used the factory-second panes in a modified glazing system that Nora had designed herself, with a custom gasket profile she'd had fabricated by a rubber products company in Waterloo. The gasket accommodated the size variation in the Hartfield panes, without requiring each pane to be individually shimmed. She'd filed a provisional patent application on the gasket design in March of 2012 with help from an Iowa State Technology Transfer Office program for agricultural innovations. She was 25 years old. In 2011, the greenhouse grossed $91,000. In 2012, with the freestanding structure online for the final quarter, it grossed $138,000. She'd hired 2 part-time workers, a woman from Tama and a man from the next county over, and was paying them $14 an hour at a time when the county's agricultural wage average was $9.50. She'd also begun selling starts, tomato, pepper, cucumber seedlings, to home gardeners and small market farmers in the spring, which added a revenue stream she hadn't initially planned for, but which accounted for $18,000 in 2012 gross. The community had noticed. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the way that rural communities notice things, through the slow accumulation of evidence that is impossible to argue with. People drove past on County Road 14 and saw the glass structures catching the winter sun. People at the co-op had started asking Peter about it, and Peter, who was not a man given to boasting, answered their questions with the specific numbers Nora had given him and let the numbers speak. The restaurants in Cedar Rapids had started mentioning Vandermeer Greenhouse on their menus, not as a marketing exercise, but because Margot and the other chefs had started getting questions about where the winter tomatoes came from. The specialty grocery in Ames had put a small sign above the produce section. The farmers market in Tama had given her a permanent spot. Crowley had heard about it. He'd heard about it the way you hear about things you've dismissed. Sideways, in pieces, never quite adding up to the full picture. Someone mentioned the greenhouse at the co-op. Someone else mentioned the restaurant contracts. He filed it away as a local curiosity. A girl with some cracked glass and a machine shed. He didn't revise his assessment. Not yet. Let me tell you about the summer of 2012, because that was when the assessment became impossible to maintain. Iowa experienced one of the most severe droughts in its recorded history that summer. June, July, and August brought less than 30% of normal precipitation across the central part of the state. The corn crop failed across much of Tama County. Peter's north fields, which he'd planted to corn that year, came in at 61 bushels per acre against a planned yield of 180. The soybean fields did better, but not well. It was a hard year. It was a hard year for almost every conventional operation in the county. The greenhouse didn't care about the drought. The greenhouse had its own water supply. A cistern Nora had installed in 2011, fed by the machine shed's roof drainage, supplemented by a dedicated well line she'd run from the farm's existing irrigation infrastructure. The drip system used 40% less water per pound of produce than field irrigation. The crops inside the glass structures were growing in a controlled environment that Nora managed to within 2 degrees of target temperature and 5% of target humidity. While the corn in the north fields was burning, the tomatoes in the greenhouse were producing at the highest rate Nora had recorded. A combination of the intense summer light filtered through the tempered glass and the supplemental CO2 enrichment system she'd added in the spring. In August of 2012, while Peter was walking the north fields and doing the math on what the drought had cost him, the greenhouse produced 11,400 pounds of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. Revenue for August alone was $31,000. Peter came into the greenhouse on a Saturday morning in late August. He walked the length of the center aisle without saying anything, looking at the plants the way he looked at his corn, with the specific evaluative attention of a man who has spent his life reading crops. He stopped at the end of the aisle and stood with his hands in his pockets. He said, after a while, that she'd been right. Not about everything, not about the whole idea, but that she'd been right in the way that mattered, which was that the greenhouse didn't fail when everything else did. He said she could decide the rotation. He meant the field rotation, what went where on the farm's acreage, including which field she wanted for expansion. It was not a small thing for Peter Vandermeer to say. Nora knew that. She thanked him, and he nodded, and they walked back to the house together. The 8th load of glass panes arrived in the fall of 2013. The 9th and final load arrived in March of 2014. 9 years after the first, 6 years after the second. By then, Nora had used every pane from every load. The last panes from the 9th delivery went into a propagation greenhouse she'd built in 2014, specifically for the seedling starts business, which by that year was generating $42,000 annually on its own. The Hartfield glass facility had retooled its production line in 2013 and was no longer producing panes in the sizes that had been coming to County Road 14. The supply was finished. She had used all of it. Let me tell you about the science one more time, because by 2014, Nora had stopped being a person who read research and had become a person who produced it. She'd been invited to present at the Iowa State University Extension Service Annual Conference in February of 2014. A 45-minute slot on the economics of small-scale controlled environment agriculture using reclaimed and non-standard glazing materials. She'd brought 3 notebooks of data, 5 years of yield records, and a cost per square foot comparison between her structure and a comparable new-build commercial greenhouse. Her structure had cost $2.14 per square foot to glaze. A comparable new build using standard commercial tempered glass would have cost between $14 and $18 per square foot. The structural performance over 5 years, thermal retention, light transmission, snow load response, was statistically indistinguishable between her reclaimed glass installation and the new build benchmark. She'd had the data reviewed by 2 agricultural engineers at Iowa State before the presentation. They'd confirmed the methodology. She presented the gasket design as a replicable system for accommodating size variation in reclaimed glazing materials. 47 people attended the presentation. Several of them were extension agents from other counties. 2 were researchers who asked for copies of her data set. 1 was a journalist from the Iowa Farmer Today. Peter attended. He sat in the 3rd row. When she finished and the room applauded, he stood up. He was not a man who stood up in rooms to applaud. Nora saw him do it and looked away quickly because the alternative was crying in front of 47 people at an extension service conference, which was not something she was willing to do. The Iowa Farmer Today article ran in April of 2014. The headline called her a greenhouse innovator. The article described the reclaimed glass system, the gasket design, the 5-year revenue trajectory, and the drought year comparison. It mentioned Dale Crowley's name once, in a sentence that quoted Nora's description of the early skepticism she'd encountered. Crowley read the article. He knew which conversation she was describing. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 2015, because that was when Dale Crowley drove out to County Road 14 on a Wednesday afternoon and knocked on the door of the farmhouse. Nora answered it. She was 30 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket with a greenhouse thermometer in the breast pocket and mud on her boots from the propagation house. She looked, by that point, like every other farmer in Tama County, except that she was standing in front of a farm that had generated $218,000 in greenhouse revenue in the previous 12 months, which was not like every other farm in Tama County. Crowley stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. He was 64 now. He said he'd read the article. He said he'd been watching what she'd done. He said he had a customer, a young couple in Hardin County who wanted to build a greenhouse operation on a limited budget and had asked him about reclaimed glazing options, and he didn't know enough about the subject to help them. He said he thought she might. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said, without particular heat, but without any softness either, that she remembered him telling her a 22-year-old with a horticulture degree and a pile of cracked glass wasn't going to build a greenhouse business in Tama County, Iowa. She said she remembered the men at the co-op counter. She said she didn't bring that up to make him feel bad. She brought it up because the lesson she'd learned from that conversation was more useful than anything else she'd taken out of it, and she wanted him to know what the lesson was. The lesson, she said, was not that cracked glass is as good as new glass. The lesson was that the people who know what something is worth are almost never the people who've decided in advance that it has no value. The glass wasn't worthless because it was cracked. It was worthless to the people who'd already decided it was, and a greenhouse business wasn't impossible for a 22-year-old with a horticulture degree. It was impossible for the people who couldn't imagine it being possible. Those were different problems, and only one of them was hers to solve. Crowley listened to all of this. He didn't argue. He said he understood. He asked if she'd be willing to talk to the couple in Hardin County. She said yes. She invited him in for coffee. Let me tell you about what happened after that, because the story doesn't end in Crowley's hat in his hands on the porch. Over the next 3 years, Nora consulted on 14 small-scale greenhouse builds across Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, each one using some proportion of reclaimed or factory-second glazing material sourced through a network she'd built with 3 glass manufacturers and 2 regional salvage operations. She charged a flat consulting fee of $3,000 per project plus expenses, and she provided each client with a copy of the gasket design specification and the site assessment protocol she'd developed. Several of those projects used the provisional patent she'd filed in 2012, for which she received a licensing fee. By 2017, the consulting revenue had grown to $41,000 annually, running alongside the greenhouse operation itself. The greenhouse operation, by 2017, was generating between $320,000 and $360,000 in annual gross revenue across the growing, seedling starts, and consulting arms of what Nora had formally incorporated as Vandermeer Controlled Environments, LLC, in 2013. The total capital invested from the beginning through 2017 was $67,000, including every structure, every system upgrade, every equipment purchase, and the patent filing. The cracked glass panes had cost nothing. 9 years of flatbed deliveries to County Road 14 had provided the foundation of a business that, by any measure, should not have been possible on a farm in Tama County, Iowa, in 2009. Let me tell you about the gasket, because the gasket is the part of the story that most people overlook, and it's the part that matters most. The rubber profile Nora designed in 2012 to accommodate the size variation in the Hartfield factory second panes was not a complicated piece of engineering. It was a compression-fit channel with a variable width cavity that could accept panes ranging from 3/4 of an inch to 1¼ inches in nominal width variation without requiring shimming or caulking. The fabricator in Waterloo had made her a test run of 50 linear feet for $280, and she'd tested it on the freestanding structure's first bay before committing to the full quantity. It worked the first time. She'd modified the profile once, in 2013, to improve the drainage channel at the base, and the modified version had been in production since then. The Iowa State Technology Transfer Office had helped her convert the provisional patent to a full utility patent in 2014. By 2017, the gasket had been licensed to 4 manufacturers of greenhouse glazing components, and the licensing revenue, while not large, was consistent. It was also the thing that most clearly demonstrated what Nora had actually done, which was not simply to build a greenhouse from free glass, but to solve a problem that the industry had considered solved, and to solve it better from the outside, with less money and more observation than anyone who'd been inside the problem had thought to bring. The Extension Service Conference presentation had been the beginning of that. She'd given versions of it 11 times by 2017, at venues ranging from the Iowa State Horticulture Department to a regional sustainable agriculture conference in Madison, Wisconsin, to a USDA-sponsored workshop on low-capital greenhouse development in rural communities. At each presentation,